charity, you are not required to exercise expenditure responsibility unless the granting vehicle of which you make a grant to the Chamber of Commerce, which is a non-charity, as a 501c6. So if you're making a grant from a donor advised fund, that's when you would be required to exercise expenditure responsibility. Any other fund type of the community foundation would not need expenditure responsibility. So that's kind of the baseline here. And they would talk about the difficulties of making the grants and whatnot. So Eileen, do you know what fund type you were contemplating making the grants from?
This would be from our emergency response fund that we activated.
So a non-donor advised fund, yes.
Yes.
So expenditure responsibility would not be required. Now, there is a requirement to make sure that the funds will be used for charitable purposes, but that doesn't mean that you need to go all the way through expenditure responsibility just to make sure that funds will be used correctly for charitable purposes. And it seems like it is. I think, if I heard correctly, the purpose was to purchase gift cards for frontline or people who are in need. The only thing, and I don't know if Ben wants to chime in here, the only thing that I do think would be a concern is the benefits to chamber members and whether gift cards are only being purchased through these members of the chamber, because that could be an indication of private benefit for the chamber. And so I think more facts will be required in that case. But generally speaking, it seems like this would be a charitable endeavor.
Thank you.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is I just want to clarify. So the grant is going to the chamber. The chamber is then turning around and buying gift certificates from various restaurants and then distributing them based on criteria that they've developed as far as how they're distributing. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess ideally in your due diligence, that, as Bryan mentioned, doesn't need to rise to the level of expenditure responsibility. It would be good to see some evidence of, how they're going to go about making that determination as to who receives the gift cards. And as Bryan mentioned as well, make sure that there's not some suggestion that they're only going to be buying gift cards from businesses that are members of the chamber as a general rule. I mean, I guess depending on how many businesses you have in the area that aren't members of the chamber, that might be largely, it probably will be mostly chamber members, but as long as it's not limited to only chamber members being able to sell those gift cards for the purposes of this fund, I think that's fine.
Perfect, and I think that addresses Sandy's question that was in the chat box, Ben. So.
Oh, I didn't see that yet.
Yeah.
So Nancy, do you want to chime in? Good to see you, and maybe just on the expenditure responsibility, the questions that raised for you.
I just like to say what I heard, so I'm processing correctly. And so outside of this current environment, that if we have an opportunity to fund something, be that something through a chamber of commerce or another business, that as long as our board is agreeing that this is for a charitable purpose, we do not need to do the expenditure oversight.
Right.
And it's not from a donor advised.
As long as, non-DAP.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So if it's from our community granting program, which is open to primarily 501c3s, it is possible for us to, like our chamber does some really great stuff with our K through 12 district. So that would be something we could do.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, there I learned something. This was worth the price of admission.
And Sandy clarified that it's not a grant; it's just an expense of the fund. But I think we can address that there is it's still from a PR perspective, from how you communicate it, it's still a charitable investment in the community. Any thoughts or clarifications on that, Ben or Bryan?
Right. Yeah, I think that is true. Like how you're going to classify that is different from probably how it's presented, in publicity materials. But technically speaking, that would be an expense of the fund. you're not granting to, you know, in your case, you were talking about buying, because your question, Sandy, was about buying masks from a local for-profit.
Let's shift gears a little
I
bit.
think that in that case, that definitely is an expense of the fund. In the case of the chamber, you know, I think you're making a grant for them to then administer this program that you've determined is charitable, and you aren't in this case required to exercise expenditure responsibility, although you should do due diligence to ensure that it is charitable. So in that case, I do think that, you know, it looks more like a grant than in the case where you are actually as the foundation. You know, if you were going to go out as the foundation and buy gift cards yourself and then distribute them, yes, that's definitely an expense in my mind. But here where the question was actually giving to the chamber and then the chamber is running that program, I think that looks more like a grant to me. The way
and just to clarify for everyone, you know, Sandy had raised a question ahead of time about actually purchasing from local businesses, turning around and utilizing some subsidiary to help identify families in need. And in their case, they were utilizing school social workers to both support local businesses by purchasing gift cards and then making them available to families in need. So putting together sort of pieces to make that work. And in that case, when you're buying those gift cards, it's essentially an expense of the fund. It's got a charitable purpose. It's good to document that to clarify what it was used for. But from a PR perspective, that it's all the same notion as what a grant would do in the terms of helping other people and putting together resources. So let's shift a little bit. Let's continue. So the grants to individuals, it's not just in terms of helping these you know, chambers of commerce or helping out local businesses. What about in the case of a class of people? So one of our folks raised a really great question. See if she's on here. Is Sarah with us from Humboldt Area Foundation? Sarah?
I sure am.
Hi there. Good. You want to give us a sense? I feel like I'm about to say like, hi, welcome to the call or something. And you know, but Sarah, give us a sense of the class that you're working with and sort of what some of the parameters are that you're running into here, because this is a good one.
Sure. Well, we've already set up a COVID response fund that has been making rapid response grants to nonprofits. But some of the questions we're getting are around artists, because we know that many artists are really financially suffering right now and don't necessarily qualify for unemployment or other benefits for regular employees. And so we, of course, are trying to work with nonprofit partners to see if there could be a nonprofit intermediary to help artists. But if that doesn't pan out, I'm wondering if there are any special parameters to grant to individual artists during a time of disaster.
So we got all kinds of goodies in there, Ben and Bryan. I mean, you're talking about a class of people, how to support individuals, how do you document the, you know, substantiating their need. Feel free to go wherever you want to go. Tackle that one.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll kick off and just say, I think, you know, as a general proposition, the idea of supporting, you know, artists as a class, assuming that there are enough people who meet that definition in your community to constitute a charitable class, such that you don't know the identity of every possible person in that class already, sounds fine to me. Determining neediness, I think, really is just the same objective. If you're looking at someone who is affected by the current pandemic, you know, you're not looking at, in the case of, you know, an employer-sponsored fund, you have to look more closely at financial neediness as far as distancing it from, you know, tying it to the causes this pandemic. I think with something like this, you know, you of course can tie it to the pandemic and have that being the cause of the hardship, but you know, you don't have to worry about, as with an employer sponsored fund, the idea that you have to make sure you're not compensating employees for something that is employer caused. So I think you have a little more leeway since it's not employer related. I think as long as you're able to determine that these people are financially needy and that there's a charitable class served by saying, you know, artists And you could say, of course, visual, musicians, performing arts, whatever the class you want to include is, then yeah, to me that seems like a pretty clear-cut charitable class, and assistance to them for financial need is certainly within your purview.
Yeah, we're not talking about John Mellencamp here, are we? Or Neil Diamond. All right, so thank you, Sarah. I appreciate you jumping in. And in the chat function, I believe my colleague Manuela is going to share our associated resources about how to make grants to individuals and small businesses that I do think covers a lot of this, so that you all can refer back to it. It's under the coronavirus resource hub that the council has. We created a whole tips and resources section for community foundations, and that's where that can be found. In fact, we just posted, or we're working on posting, if we haven't yet, a policy that our friends at Greater Des Moines have created for their rural affinity groups to try to help small businesses in rural economies. So they're going to share their actual policy with you to give some sense of what they've been creating.
Hey, Brad, I just want to add
please.
one more thing, just to add on to Ben's discussion, which I think was spot on. The IRS isn't quite determinative of who is a needy person. And so I think that could be based on the facts. I just want to give you just one thing based on the regs. Just an example of what they use is examples of needy persons include a person who is financially impoverished as a result of low income. So they're alone, and I'm just going to share that if you want to read that later tonight if you can't sleep. There's the citation there if you want to take a look at that. So there's going to be examples of what the IRS determines as a needy individual. So you could take a look at that and take it from what you may, but then again, it just shows you that there's no determination of what exactly a needy person is.
My guess is you knew that reg by memory alone, didn't you, Brian?
No,
Yeah, I feel like we could play a game there. Let's Julie raised the question in the chat feature, Julie Buck, about supporting small businesses. I think this ties in nicely to the general conversation of how to support small businesses, and we can certainly get into that question about direct support to a for-profit. I'd like to bring Sandy from Clemens Community Foundation in, because I think rather than just writing a blank check to a business as Julie is raising, Sandy's got a unique way to try to help at least a particular for-profit for the good. And maybe we can dovetail that into then just broader programs for small businesses. So Sandy, if you're with me, it looks like you're unmuted. Good to hopefully get to have you here. Are you with me?
I am.
Great. So give us a framework of what you're cooking up there to help schools.
Well, schools are looking at going back, of course, and so we were thinking about masks. We contacted a local manufacturer who has converted their operations to making masks to stay alive. They're a textile company, and called them. And at the same time that I called, they're just getting ready to start children's masks. So what we're looking at doing, and because it's a smaller school district, we're looking at buying the masks for all children between the ages of 5 and 9, and providing those to the schools to distribute to the kids. So, my question was, okay, very similar to the buying gift certificates, can we go ahead and buy those masks, expense it to the disaster relief fund, and then just hand them over to the schools? That way we're supporting a local business that's trying to retool and helping our school system. Does that sound good?
Yeah, please, Ben, Bryan. Comments, thoughts?
Yeah, on its face, I think that sounds like a charitable endeavor. The fact that you are buying these from a for-profit group alone, is not a problem. It's, you are kind of in the same as that example we were talking about earlier with buying gift cards for local restaurants to distribute to workers and their families. I think it's largely the same. You're supporting, of course, a local business. There is that component of it, but you're not, at least my understanding is that this isn't something that they're not, price gouging you on these masks. It's more to keep their operations going is why they've reopened, and you see this as an opportunity to buy these masks that they're going to be making, provide for your students in your local schools as a
Right.
requirement of going back to school.
Right.
So I think that is fine. Is this the only place that you could get them? Is it, I guess that's sort of a question too, is if there are other sources for it that may be more cost effective, it's of course worth exploring that, but there's the component of supporting local businesses as well that I think we've discussed in previous editions of this meeting. There is a charitable component to economic development activity, and I think you certainly are capable of making the call to invest in local businesses where you have that option as a way to fulfill a charitable purpose, like providing masks to school children. So, Bryan, do you have anything to add on that?
I think it's good. Yeah, I mean, the aspect of making sure that you get it at a better price point, I think that's just a matter of prudence on the part of
right. I mean, that's where I guess I was going with. If it doesn't seem like the prices here are astronomical and not in line with what else you could be spending on these masks, the fact that you're getting it from a local business doesn't, it's not inherently that you're providing a private benefit just because you are buying locally. You've got to buy them from somebody. So I think you certainly have the discretion to buy from a local provider, and as long as it's not seen as potentially an imprudent use of those funds, you're meeting that objective, fulfilling that charitable purpose for that fund.
Well, what I tell members all the time is, you guys at the community foundations, I might have said this at the last iteration of the legal office hours, is that you guys are the philanthropic experts in your community. So the best places to get these masks, the best organizations to fund, the most prudent ways to use those charitable dollars. So I think we would defer to you guys and where you would put those funds towards.
So I'll try to draw the correlation here. What I like about that example is we have very tangible ways of supporting local business, local workers, and providing local product that helps a local charity or a local charitable cause. So there's a lot wrapped up in that. Where I think it is distinguished between the suggestion or the concept that Julie's talking about, where it's just a blanket program of providing support to small businesses, that's where it gets a lot more tricky because, right, guys? I mean, you're talking about how do you define that class? What are the determinations of who gets support and who doesn't? So what I might ask is, I think, Julie, if you're able to unmute, you're welcome to help clarify and make sure I've got it right. But I'd like the attorneys to maybe just untangle that a bit. So Julie, welcome. Are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah, so any context that you want to add that we can just make sure that we're framing it correctly before we kind of jump into some of the constraints we might try to look at?
Sure. So our county had a flood in 2013, a tornado in 2013, and another tornado in 2015. So we're very well versed in making grants to nonprofits and individuals who are victims of disaster. And I keep going back to some IRS guidance right after the Oklahoma tornadoes in 14, something like that. And so back to economic development. A community cannot recover if their small businesses are destroyed and cannot reopen. But natural disasters is totally different than this pandemic. So you can look at a building and see that it was destroyed or half of it underwater, whatever the case may be. This one's a little bit different. So we have a number of small businesses. We're in Illinois, so we've got our stay-at-home order. So we've got plenty of non-essential businesses that are not operating, or at least, let's say, small retailers. They have to do curbside delivery and pickup and all that kind of stuff. Restaurants can only do carry-out, etc. So now we're being asked if we had, let's say, $50,000 more in our disaster fund, would we be willing to give $1,000 grants to small businesses after an application process? And we've been collecting models from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and stuff like that. And most of them are applying and getting their PPP, and they're getting grants from DCEO, our Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity here in the state and stuff like that. But there's still need. And so my first question was, would $1,000 be kind of pittance? And the answer was no. There are plenty of small businesses that could take that $1,000 and pay their rent or their mortgage or whatever. So that's kind of the avenue we're going down. So I understand the conversation about going to a small business who provides a product that we can purchase in bulk to pass through to residents, to clients, to other nonprofits, et cetera. But I'd rather go quite a bit more elementary. The success of our community going forward is going to be greatly hinged on whether these small businesses are going to last. And with our stay-at-home order now being extended into a second month, it's going to make more small businesses not able to reopen in June or July or whatever. So yes, I am asking flat out, can I set up an application program for small businesses to get $1,000 grant from the disaster fund?
Yeah, I'll start off with that. And I like to, I commend you on your example of the building that's destroyed by a tornado versus this situation, because that's what we've really been dealing with since this all started. And we've all collectively tried to get our heads around, what does grant making to for-profit businesses look like in this disaster, because we don't have something to compare it to. And you know, the problem, as you mentioned, is that in a natural disaster traditional situation, which is where the guidance that we have from the IRS really comes from, it talks about rebuilding certain, you know, hard hit areas of a community. Obviously, you can tell where those are in a natural disaster. You know where the tornado went through and where it spared. Here, it is pervasive, and there are so many areas that are in need. And so, yes, we've you know, arrived on this idea that, especially in the case of these short-term grants and you know, short-term smaller amounts, I think is really a great way to go. You're acknowledging that people are applying for and are getting approval for some of the federal loan programs, but there's also an understanding that some of those, you know, there is a short-term need that they may not have the funding in time to meet that need. And so I think community foundations can really step in, close those gaps for small businesses in their communities, and especially in the short term where there is need, and these programs that are set up to benefit them, you know, they may not receive the funding in time to actually make these payments if their rent is due. Last time I checked, tomorrow is the first of the month. So yeah, it's clearly people have these real timelines, these deadlines that are you know, demanding a lot of their limited resources. And so I think, yeah, if your community businesses have told you $1,000 helps, I certainly think that's within the limits of what we have sort of arrived at as, you know, based on precedent and based on our, you know, our understanding of economic development activities and in the light of the current situation. Bryan, do you?
I totally agree with that. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And so if we were to look at this from an economic development standpoint, as the, you know, going back to the philanthropic experts that you guys are, I don't think that you only need to look at that particular business or the businesses to see economic development. We always talk about making these grants so that the areas aren't a blighted area of the community, or because without these businesses, as you mentioned, the economy would just tank. I wanted to say this, is that the IRS has held that sponsoring economic development is permissible so long as the public benefit is demonstrable. And demonstrating public benefit here, I think, would definitely be making sure that these businesses, not just the businesses themselves, but that area stays afloat, and therefore the community stays afloat. And so once again, if you could demonstrate that but for these grants, that these businesses probably won't make it. And so I think you have a pretty good argument to show that by making these grants to for-profit organizations, that could be and most likely would be a charitable activity.
Okay, and this is Julie again. So let me just flesh out a phrase that you just said. But for, if the small businesses do not survive, they're not paying property taxes for the schools, for the libraries. They're not paying income tax that goes to the state that turns around and comes to different, they're not paying sales tax, they're not paying hotel motel tax, etc. So thank you. I had not thought of or remembered the but for, so I will make sure that I include that in our application.
And then you could, adding to that, Julie, you could even talk about lessening the burdens of government in that case then, because if they're not paying their portion of the taxes, then where would they come from? And so by doing that, I think that you would mitigate the need for the government to step in. And so therefore you'd have another aspect of charitable endeavor through economic development at your disposal there.
Thank you.
All right, so one clarifying question. That was great, thanks guys. I wanted to just close up on grants so that we can shift to some board governance and using our time wisely. One of the questions that was asked from one of the attendees was, in the case of purchasing goods for the benefit of the schools from the local manufacturer, why not just make the grant directly to the school and then let them purchase them? Certainly that is an eligible option. In terms of making the grant to the schools. I think this is a pure business decision, in my opinion, of what helps make what's the right angle that you're trying to aim for. And in the case of Sandy and Clemens, I believe that they're trying to directly engage with local business. They're trying to support the economy, similar to what Julie's doing with small businesses. And so these are all purely business decisions, right, guys? Any thoughts or comments there? But there's nothing wrong with making the grant to the schools and let them, exclusive, what they're purchasing. And there's nothing wrong with going directly to the business and purchase outright and then have them distributed accordingly. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, Brad. I think it is a business decision. I guess, from a purely pragmatic side of things, granting to a school district, they might have, purchasing agreements in place that might allow them to get the supplies at a lower cost. So I guess in a way you want to just weigh what is important for you to maximize, the most masks for your dollar, or ensuring, support of a local business, which I think, like Brad said, that's really depends on how you want to present it to the community as a, clearly either way is positive, but there's that added benefit of supporting local business. And
I'm going to go out on a hunch here and just say that at the end of the day, a few pennies to keep it local and to keep people in work and so forth is a real win, but that's certainly my opinion, Sandy. So thank you. And thank you to Sally for bringing up the good point that sometimes procurement policies that schools have to abide by could become very cumbersome, could really hinder this whole process of just moving products to end result. So, okay, so this was fun. We talked a lot in the grant making to individuals to support direct classes of people. We talked about small businesses, engaging your partners like the chambers of commerce. So thank you to everyone who participated through in. We've got some more, but I see we've got Billy Atkins, we've got Charles from Anderson, we've got some board members who have joined us. So thank you to them. There's probably more out there. So with them being at the table, they were able to key up some good governance questions. And so thank you first of all for you two gentlemen who are with us, for being board members and your kind service to the community, to the foundation, and spending time with us here. Charles, I'd like to unmute you if you're up for it, and I'd like you to share with us one of your questions around liability. If you flagged for me the notion of funding nonprofits and what happens if they open up, provide services and so forth. But Charles, are you able to unmute and share us your question? Maybe I can even do
There, I've done it. Thank you very much. So this is Charles Anderson, San Juan Island Community Foundation. We're as far northwest as one can get in the U.S., not being Alaska. The question is that we have funding of some, and specifically potentially large groups, schools and summer schools, camps, and all of these are not yet open, but depending on what the public health order and the governor's orders may be opening up for the summer, for summer sessions. And these are things that we are traditionally funded. And so the question is the liability, both of our organization, the Community Foundation and its board, but also for the organizations that we're funding, which are nonprofits, but their boards. And I say this because I was in a Zoom meeting with a law school that I privately work with in a philanthropic way. And the message there was that they're already seeing in their partner firms a lot of activity in defense of against some aggressive trial lawyers who are saying, what a wonderful opportunity. Somebody goes back to work or back to school, they get sick, and this is a huge can of worms. And so my questions are both what your take is on that, and then a sub-question is, does any of the force majeure stuff affect directors and liability insurance, directors and officers liability insurance? Because I wondered if there's somehow we get caught out even though we have the insurance.
Thank you, Charles. There's so many good questions in there. So Bryan, Ben, please dig in.
This is a great law school exam question. So let me just say that if there were going to be any types of lawsuits here, we'd have to take a look at what would the cause of action be here. The cause of action in any type of in this situation would be a negligence claim, Charles. And so under any kind of negligence, and I don't practice tort law, but what you have to establish for tort is you have to show a duty, a breach, and a causation, as well as damages. I think that if you could have as good as lawyers, plaintiffs' lawyers as you can, but I don't know if they can actually show a causation here, because you'll have to show a proximate cause to that injury. My parents met in the Philippines back in the 70s. Does that mean that I owe it to the Philippines for my existence? So the reason why I bring that up is that you can go as far back as you want, but to use the phrase that I used with Julia's, but for you making a grant to this organization, did that person get sick? And I think the remoteness of that would be a problem for the plaintiff's lawyers to establish that that was the proximate cause. And so I think that the devil is in the details, and this would be a matter for the jury to decide. But I think that that would be the one issue that the plaintiff's lawyers would have a difficult time proving, that causation. As far as the D&O insurance, I like discussing insurance matters because, as we know, insurance covers everything unless it doesn't cover anything. And so what I'm saying by that is that you'll have to take a look at your specific D&O insurance policy to see if it talks about force majeures and anything else. And if I could talk about the liabilities with respect to these camps or schools, I think that you also have to take a look at, possibly including indemnification clauses in your grant agreements. These are the hold harmless clauses that says you will hold the foundation harmless for any activity that the grantee does. And so, but to go back to that though, Charles, I do think that the issue here would be the proximate cause and whether making that grant was the cause of that person getting sick.
think Bryan gets an A on that torts exam question.
I also think we do owe a lot to the Philippines and your parents for giving you us. But go ahead, Ben.
One other aspect is on behalf of the board of the school that we're funding or the camp that we're funding, what about their boards? So this, they're directly making the decision to open, clearly in a legal sense relative to the governor's orders and the public health order. But if somebody gets sick, kids get sick and in the camp, and maybe it even has to be closed down again, what liability does the board of the actual nonprofit organization that we're funding, where do they stand?
Charles, there's always going to be an issue of vicarious liability. Vicarious liability is where plaintiffs will try to get to the deep pockets. And so in this case, the deep pockets would be the school or be you. And although, because I already put you guys to the side and say you probably not be liable, I do think that there still has to be a separate inquiry, a separate analysis of whether, but for them opening, was there any mitigating circumstances that this person got sick? And as I mentioned, I don't practice the area of law, but I do think that the causation, opening it up, it allowed that environment for someone to get sick, but there had to be some mitigating circumstances that someone did get sick, because just because you show up at a locale does not guarantee the fact that you will get sick. I do think the causation would be a matter there for them to analyze as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, and it's also worth looking at, if we're talking about a school that's considering, they're following the public health officials' guidelines. If it has been deemed safe for them to reopen by the public health officials, I think that analysis of their duty in the case of protecting students from getting sick, I think they've taken steps obviously by adhering to public health guidance. I think a lot of that plays into this question of whether there truly was a breach on their part of this duty, if they are in fact following guidelines as what is acceptable within. It's the same idea if your barbershop reopens and you choose to go to the barbershop and then you get sick and can somehow prove that it was your barber, is he liable for getting you sick and for damages there? I think with this situation, certainly, as you mentioned, people can sue and will sue someone for almost anything. And I don't doubt that we'll see an increase in that from this event and from the attempts to reopen. But ultimately, the merits of those claims, I think, will depend on the ability to show that this was truly, a breach of this duty to act in a way that would keep somebody from harm, and whether such a duty existed, and whether a breach in fact caused them to get sick, I think can be pretty difficult in a situation where it's hard sometimes to prove where transmission came from.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to add there too, what Ben mentioned is, and how they acted, and based on the guidelines that Ben mentioned, and that if they followed those guidelines, they would be acting reasonable. And so in any kind of tort litigation, you talk about whether the defendant was acting unreasonable. So an unreasonable act would be having someone on staff that they knew had the coronavirus and allowed them to work. That would absolutely be unreasonable on the part of the defendant's school. And so I think that would be a reason why a plaintiff could recover in that case. But if they were acting reasonable in all aspects, then I don't see how they would have been determined to breach that duty.
I feel like I just sent you guys on a fishing expedition, so I'm going to bring you back. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Bryan. I'd like to bring in Todd if I can. Todd had really brought up some good questions that I think folks are dealing with there in Louisiana. Todd, are you able to unmute and join me? Is Todd with us?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me, Brad?
I can. Thank you. Please set up the stage. We're down to the last 10 to 15 minutes here, so we're going to maybe spend just 5 minutes or so on this, Ben and Bryan, and then we're going to get one more topic in if we can. So Todd, give us a sense of what you're dealing with on the employer emergency relief funds and so forth.
I guess I was just curious to know if there is a difference between employee emergency relief funds and employee disaster relief funds. We have a lot of employee emergency relief funds that are open year-round for our clients, but we also have some where the clients only activate them for disasters. I know we're kind of in a strange time right here, but I guess I was just curious to know if there's a difference there, and I guess if you can just touch on that and just start there.
Thank you, Todd. So let's talk about the language being used here. Emergency relief funds from employers versus disaster relief funds. Let's get into the nitty gritty there, Ben or Bryan, on the difference there. And then let's maybe just back up a little bit and talk in general about these tools and their place. So Ben, I see you're unmuted. You want that one?
Right. So we're talking about disaster funds for federally declared disasters is what I'm assuming we're talking about in this case versus those that are available for other types. And Brad and I were discussing this before the call. In my experience, not everyone uses the same terminology. I think people tend to use the terms disaster relief or emergency relief, sometimes fairly interchangeably, or assistance funds, for various purposes. But I know in the context of corporations, they will be more clear about whether something is an assistance fund versus a disaster relief fund, because for them it really is important to delineate the origin of the damages that they're helping assist with. So in the context of a disaster fund, where in the fund agreement it says only for use in qualified disasters or federally declared disasters, or whatever the language might be, it's referring to section 139 of the tax code that sets out the situations in which employer-sponsored funds or employers themselves may pay for qualified disaster relief payments for their employees, in which case those payments would not be taxable to the recipient. And in the case of a private foundation, they wouldn't constitute an act of self-dealing on the part of the private foundation. So in the context of a community foundation, I find that there is, you can still use the terms, and I understand what people mean when they say disaster versus emergency, but I think it really goes back to, what does the fund agreement say? What was it established for? If the fund agreement says it's qualified disaster only, or federally declared, presidentially declared disaster, whatever the terminology that it uses is, it's limited to those purposes. If it's for other types of emergencies, we look at examples like, an employee has a house fire or something else where it's obviously not a natural disaster or a disaster on the scale of something that would be declared as a federal disaster. But of course, to that individual who's affected by it, it's just as bad. So that's really where I've seen the line drawn between those terms. Does that provide kind of a good overview?
Yes, that's helpful.
You're on mute, Brad.
Just got to say, I clearly don't know how to keep time because it's 3:50 here on Eastern time, and I believe we were going to try to wrap up 30, 45 minutes. Is there any other questions out there that need to be answered? Please, raise your hand, throw it up in the chat. While we answer one more question I'm going to throw at you guys, we'll see if there's any lingering questions that we need to address. This is just on the questions of funds being underwater, the reality that most investment pools are facing right now. So the notion of, of MIFA, what we need to know there in prudence in terms of continuing to spend and just staying the course with providing grant making in these very difficult times and providing the relief that is needed. Comments there on underwater funds of MIFA and just staying the course. Brian?
Russ?
Yeah,
Oh, I
please.
thought you were asking questions from the group.
No, I want to go ahead and just
No,
kind of
So the difference between UMIFA, the previous standard, and UPMIFA, which is available in all states except I think in your state, Glenn, of Pennsylvania, is that UMIFA has a prudence standard, and so I think that in those statutes or the acts of UMIFA, they talk about, and I pulled it up here. There's what, seven factors to determine whether an organization is prudent in its spending. And so you can take a look at that. And so that talks about the duration and preservation of the endowment fund, the purposes of the institution and the endowment fund, general economic conditions. So they can look at the general economic conditions, the possible effect of inflation or deflation, the expected total return from income and the appreciation of investments, other resources of the institution, and finally, the investment policy of the institution. So those are the levels and kind of the factors, 7 factors that is provided in MIFA, and whether you could be and how you could be spending. Because as I mentioned in the previous act, UMIFA, it just talked about the historic value. Here it talks about prudence. And oftentimes in the past, what I've seen in various cases is that organizations that are trying to be prudent sometimes go underwater because of those conditions, and then in better years they're not underwater, and in more lean years they are. But I want to say that MIFA does contemplate that. Brad,
Ben, anything?
anything there?
I just want to urge, as much as we can, communicate with our boards and with our staff. The need is heavily there right now to be spending, and so UPMIFA gives you the flexibility to do so, even in underwater funds. And no matter how you slice it, it's gonna be hard for people to ignore that you are the one sitting on resources that they desperately need. So if we can do the right thing and provide the relief now and take the long-term view of that we're perpetual entities and our long-term can last longer than that of most charities and most need. So please, stress that UPMIFA gives you that flexibility to even exceed underwater funds and evade historical principles, so to speak. So with that, thank you, Brian. Thank you, Ben. I didn't see any other burning questions, so we're going to wrap it up here. We will make this recording available, I believe. We will have another one of these on May 14th, so we can continue to pester Brian and Ben with great questions and force them to think outside the box with us. But thank you to all of you who contributed and for your additional advice and consideration. With that, I wish you all well and hope you have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, guys. Good to see you, Glenn. Thanks for joining us, Charles.
Okay, thank you. That was great, CDR. I hope you're frozen. I'll see you soon. Come on.